Hey everybody, welcome back to Chalkboard History. It's still December 5th. We're still filming. We're going to talk about a subject that some people just don't want to talk about.
Yeah.
Civil War. Everybody likes to talk about that. Civil War to civil rights.
Oh, it's the second half that really gets...
Oh boy. I was reminded just last week we were part of something where someone said we cannot talk about politics. Which, of course, makes me want to talk about politics.
Are we going to talk about that on the chalkboard? Hence the name, Chalkboard History.
Civil War to... So, what's the word, people said, what's so civil about it anyways? Well, what's so civil about civil rights? Isn't it? I just noticed it's the same word. Civil War to civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
I never understood the argument of, well, it wasn't so civil.
Well, that's because it comes out of a movie.
Yeah. Well, but what's the point in being so bent out of shape about the word choice?
I don't think there is a point. But I do think one of the big points that we are in a full-on reckoning with is the idea that we can only talk about the war. Mm-hmm. We can't talk about why.
Stick to the battle, Jacobson.
And we can't talk about what happened after.
Yeah.
Which I think is just ludicrous.
Yeah. It is interesting, though. I think the first part of that has changed over the last several years. Because I've noticed, I've given tours now 2.5 years. And there's a difference. You can talk about the beginning of the war. You can talk about the early war. And you can talk about pre-war politics. You can talk about the war itself. And nobody has any issues. But then the second you say, and now we're going to switch gears, get out of the war, and start to talk about Reconstruction, or even try and talk about how we remember the war, ooh, the kind of hackles go up. And
I don't understand. I really don't understand it. Even many years ago when I was writing my first book, I was aware that, there was a pre-war era. Mm-hmm. That's why the first line in my book is, compromise was dead.
Great line.
I think it actually is pretty great, if I do say so myself. And I wasn't really thinking beyond anything at that moment other than it just sounded good because I knew about John C. Calhoun and I knew about Jefferson Davis and I knew about Abraham Lincoln and I knew about Frederick Douglass and I was pretty aware of the pre-war era. So, but here's what's interesting. I think that now today there's a little more acceptance. Like, well, we can talk about those 1850s, right?
Right.
Because then we can argue about secession, which I also find a bit ridiculous because secession is all driven by the politics and social mores related to African slavery. But the big dilemma remains 1865 to 1964. And that 99 years. Nope. Can't talk about it.
Yeah.
Because we just can't. And I think it is so fascinating. I think there's 3 groups of people now in the country. There's white people who tie themselves in endless knots over what that 99 years means. Black people tie themselves in a different series of knots about what it means. And then there's a third group of people who live in this country who aren't either white or black, or if they are white or black, they're more recent immigrants to the country and have a kind of either general apathy or a misunderstanding about why any of it matters. And I'm very, very intrigued about how we can help people better understand that period, because that makes the war as important as it has always been.
We're always thinking about what relevancy would a story like the battles at Spring Hill and Franklin have. Well, they're part of the war. And what's the relevancy of the war? You can't get to 1961 to 1965 without 100 years earlier, this kind of 4-year bloody reckoning over the nation's history, over its past, and over its involvement with slavery, the domestic slave trade, and the politics of slavery. It's all intertwined, and all of that goes back to one word: race.
So why is this such a unique American problem. Because here's two great examples. If we talk about the Revolutionary War, there's who the British were, or what the king was doing, and what we were trying to do, meaning the revolutionaries, the colonists.
Right.
If we look at World War II, we know what the Allies were attempting to do, and we know what the other side, who it's easy to forget with some people, not just Nazis. There were the imperialists and the fascists. It's the Allies and the other guys. There's a clear difference. So if you're talking about Lexington and Concord, or Bunker Hill, or Normandy or Iwo Jima, there's an immediate greater understanding.
Right. Saving the world.
Or declaring and gaining independence
yeah.
and becoming the United States. Why is it really race? Is that what it is? Is that why we struggle with everything in front of 1861 and behind 1865?
I think it's a piece of it, certainly. It might be one of the largest pieces, but I think the other part of it is our kind of shared cultural memory, our collective memory of the war. It differs from where you're from, right? You're a Yankee from Minnesota. Your view of the American Civil War is vastly different maybe than mine from the South. But there's that construction of how we think of the war in the post-war years. The South, the conquered people, as we were talking about earlier with James Longstreet. And then there's the North, the kind of the just cause, the triumphant victors. But caught in the middle of all of that is that reconciliation movement after the war that totally kind of, it ignores the struggles of Reconstruction and the struggles to bring about the equality from 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. That's almost completely forgotten. And then we see the kind of retribution carried out after the war during the Reconstruction era against white Northerners, against black Southerners.
Okay, let's talk about reconciliation. Why is this a common theme that gets kicked around? Because I think there's plenty of evidence that this country as a whole never really reconciled
Right.
with anything other than we had fought a 4-year war and a lot of people had suffered and died.
Well, it's one of the three pillars, right? So you get the emancipationist view, which says that this war ended slavery, saved the nation. That's one. You have the lost cause view, which of the three is probably the most sort of has the longest longevity and the kind of greatest legacy in terms of its impact on our memory of the war. And then you've got the reconciliationist view, which is, well, at the end of the war, both sides came back together. They shook hands at the angle. Haven't you seen that picture? And everything was fine, and we all moved along. And here we are, ready to go into the 20th century as the world superpower that's going to be a model, a city on the hill, a model to the rest of the world about democracy. And you mentioned World War II, so I bring it up. There's that moment in the 1940s. I was reading this great book. It's called Half America by Matthew Delmont. And in there he says, black soldiers, black veterans came home after the war to homecomings that were outright brutal. Isaac Woodard, of course, and then right down in Columbia, we've got the story of James Stevenson, which is another kind of tie Civil War to civil rights through him. But there's this moment during the war where black Americans are saying, we're fighting against racial ideologies in Europe. We're fighting against racial ideologies in Japan. And yet we're fighting against racial ideologies here in the United States. It's this kind of the double V for victory campaign, right? And so there's our tie from the Civil War to World War II. And now we're pushing into that kind of modern civil rights movement because right after the war it gets started. And there's a definitive tie there going all the way back to Reconstruction.
Why is there this love affair with the Confederacy?
Well, it's the early construction, right? It's the lost cause. The E.A. Pollards of the world get out and write a new history of the Civil War, a new history of the Confederate War, a Southern history. And then there, right? But I think there's like that American, that kind of story of like American spirit, which it's always been difficult to wrap your head around. Is how can you say, well, they were patriots, they were struggling to fight for their own way of life and all these things. And at the same time, you see the confusion.
Well,
right?
yes, I do. But here's what I'm getting at. So it's the 21st century.
Right.
I don't know why we have a love affair with the Confederacy. I really don't. I see people walking around waving Confederate flags or wearing a shirt with a Confederate flag on it, or, it's heritage, it's not hate. If this shirt offends you, you don't know history, or some other gobbledygook. But I don't see anyone walking around with a King George III, and there are people who can tie their ancestry to England. They're not walking around with a Lord Cornwallis shirt. Right. So there's this weird... And I say weird because I don't understand it. I'm from the North. I don't walk around with a W.T. Sherman shirt on, or a U.S. Grant or some Yankee soldier, federal soldier. I don't walk around with that.
Right.
So it is something about the South that I can tell you without any doubt, because I was born in the North and I lived out West. Okay. So it's a cultural thing in the South. But I'm bringing it up for this reason. If you flip that coin over, because what you hear people who were in love with the Confederacy will say is, well, Northerners were racist too. Yeah. There were slaves in northern states, not in Ohio. There was never slavery there. So that's a half truth, but it's all baked into this. I love the Confederacy, and the Confederacy is somehow representative of the South, which it isn't, because there was a South before the war and a South after the war. Yeah. But here's the problem: when you flip that coin over and see everybody's a racist, or everybody's, basically a moral equivalent with the Confederacy, you give, in today's world, the more, let's say, left of spectrum approach, that the country was inherently racist, bigoted, and prejudiced from the beginning, all the way through the Civil War, and even for 100 years, until 1964 and 65. Then we started to become very righteous and very good on race and on gender and on sexuality. And now we're really good. Although things still suck, so we have to keep fighting, because you can't ever reach perfection.
Right.
And I find this all to be so troublesome, because I reminded someone just last week around the anniversary. Do you know how revolutionary 1775 and 1776 were? How unbelievably progressive and, dare I say, liberal people like Jefferson were in speaking out the way they did against the authoritarians in London? And by 1861, we had deluded ourselves to the point where we're like, no, they didn't really mean what they said.
Right.
So we're going to fight a war to continue to enslave people and destroy the United States, and then we're going to live in a half-baked distortion for 100 years. This is why I'm troubled. Because I really think that we all need to take a damn hard look at who we were to understand who we are. Because I assure you, we didn't get here by accident from Louisiana, Minnesota, now both living in Tennessee, 28, 51. We live in a world that is the great beneficiary of the founding and the Confederacy being defeated in the American Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. Those three things are all very different events. But man, you can draw a string all the way through them, and they are all good steps forward. Throw off the shackles, if you will, of the crown. Destroy and throw off the shackles forever of African slavery. And then try and finally get rid of the shackles of bigotry and prejudice and just nonsensical, I don't like you because your skin's a different color. And here we are. I was born in 71. You were born when?
95.
95.
Feel old yet? Yep.
Actually, I've said it. Your generation, my kids, are living in a whole different world. And I think we should celebrate that. And I think we should stop having a love affair with the Confederacy. And that doesn't mean you have to love, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and, want to wear, their t-shirt, but it's time to appreciate, I think, this long 250-year struggle to get where we are. And doggone it, this is still a pretty cool country.
Yeah.
This is still a great place.
I think of the imagery. And, this is one thing that I had written about it in one of our dispatch articles, is that 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, there's Martin Luther King Jr. delivering a speech in the shadow of
my
Lincoln.
goodness, absolutely.
And there's the kind of, and I saw it this weekend. I saw an image. It just stuck out in my mind. It was Washington kind of putting a crown on top of Lincoln's head, and it was like the founder and the protector. And then it's not hard to jump forward another 100 years to the figures of the civil rights movement, and even if you're going to look at Lyndon Johnson, a man who put his own personal feelings and his own kind of personal prejudices aside and said, this is what's right for the nation.
You mentioned something earlier about World War II and guys coming back and, having to, they'd seen the world. Okay. So think about the rebel soldiers in 1775 and 1776 fighting against disciplined soldiers of the British Army and somehow winning that war. And then some rando kid from upstate New York who ends up at Port Hudson, Louisiana, fighting for the preservation of the country and ultimately the destruction of slavery. And then you go to World War II. And if the United States had fallen apart in the American Civil War, so we're not to civil rights yet. Now we're only 70 years along the path. And you have American kids, white and black, who are at Anzio, liberating the Italians. And you have them at Normandy, liberating the French and opening the door of Europe. And then you have the guys who are trying to liberate Japan, the ones who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. None of that happens if the United States falls apart.
And then they come home and they see what the war had been. And
they finally said, enough.
Yep.
Enough.
And
we just showed the world what unity can do, and that the world can be a better place. But we had to come home and clean up our own mess. Yeah. So let's not mistake this reckoning with the Confederacy, meaning everybody was evil and awful, as I think some people on the far left extremes do today. But then the people I think on the far right, here we go with politics, right?
Right.
Stop hating the country and stop trying to...
I bemoan you to not be political.
Don't bemoan... Right, exactly. And then stop being in love with something that if you saw it, if you saw the horrors of African slavery, you might not be so quick to think, oh yeah, it's a good idea to break away and protect this. And I think it's okay. That's not a judgment. That's a realization that, as we mentioned in another episode, Elizabeth Verone's book, Armies of Deliverance, I think a lot of Northerners understood that they had to save the country. And in some ways that meant liberating the South. Because let's not also forget, in closing, the secession movement was a minority movement.
Yeah, the South was not monolithic in any way.
It wasn't the enslaved who were leading the secession movement, and it wasn't the poor whites. Both of those groups got dragged into this by powerful, wealthy elites, hell-bent on doing whatever it took to keep their power. And that we struggled with for 99 years. And I think we should be now remembering the civil rights era. Because if I do my math really quickly, we are now 35 plus 20 is 55. We're now almost 60 years. We are in the same spot with civil rights that people were with the Civil War in the 1930s. We're right at that tipping point where it's really history. Like history.
The voices will be gone.
The voices will be gone, and we should remember it before they're gone as a moment that, well, we had to go through it. As Lyndon Johnson said, it was time to live up to those promises. It was time to live up to the promise of equality. Anything else, Professor?
That's it.
Civil War to civil rights. Don't be afraid. Don't run away. Don't say, oh, we can't talk about it, because not talking about it, I think, is a contributing part of the problem, because if you don't talk about it, somebody else fills that void.
You know how Ethan Costello is famous for saying, let's get historical, let's get political, in history, and let's bring it in there.
Politics is a distinctly American thing, because we are the body politic. So by ignoring the political discussions, I think we're ignoring the very thing that makes this country very different, uniquely different, a representative government of the people. We should always talk about it, and if it makes us uncomfortable, maybe we learn something. So with that, thanks a lot. We'll be back after a bit.